job seeking nowadays is really hard. We are never actually properly taught how to search for a job. It takes much more than just putting together a CV. Like, how do I actually network? How does it relate to a job search? A lot of the advice out there is very outdated or insufficient. Nowadays, you are up against such a massive competition. One thing that really cost me so much time was that I approached job seeking as if it was like a common sense thing. I was basically completely unemployable. Let's blame the employers that they have unreasonable requests, and let's blame this and that. The job didn't seem that interesting, but I was just very desperate. That is the only way to succeed in your career in the long term.
Career Reset, the podcast to help you succeed as a job seeker, by Carolina Numinen.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Career Reset podcast. So if you don't know me, my name is Carolina Numinen, and I don't want to do some excessive introducing myself in this episode. I would like to eventually do some kind of separate episodes where I introduce myself and talk about my own career journey. But just as a quick background info, I live in Finland, although I'm not Finnish. I'm actually originally from Czech Republic, and what's relevant for the topic of this podcast is that I was a job seeker for many years, then I turned into a recruiter, and then I turned into a career coach, and right now I have my own career coaching business where I work with clients one-on-one, and I also created an online course for job seekers. So why am I here? Why am I making a podcast and talking to you? Not that I would need a special reason, but I think it's kind of good to introduce my intention behind creating this podcast. I myself am a huge fan of podcasts. I've been listening to podcasts for many, many years, and some of the biggest life decisions I've taken or kind of the biggest revelations I've had happen thanks to podcasts. So I like to personally consume that type of content, but also I am quite chatty, and I find podcasts to be a really good way for me to talk in depth about the topics that I want to share with people. Because up until now, my main way of talking with people has been through LinkedIn posts, also through my newsletter, through my website, through my blog. And that's great. And it's helped many people, but it's still quite limited in how much I can really go in depth. And I feel like with a lot of the career topics, it's really important to explore it from different angles to really understand in depth why some things are so hard and why some things are really necessary to succeed in careers nowadays. So that's why I decided to create this podcast. And what you can look forward to here, I will mainly be talking about job seeking because that's been the topic I've been working with the most in the past year since I started my business. So giving you different tips on succeeding as a job seeker, on finding the right jobs, talking about application materials, talking about recruitment processes, and just giving you lots of different tips to help you succeed. So if that sounds like something you are interested in, then definitely stick around. And kind of about the format of the podcast that I'm planning to keep, I am taking inspiration from the podcast that I like to listen to, and those are usually very chatty, they are quite long, they go really in depth, they don't give some generic step-by-step 10 tips. I obviously want to give tips and share the strategies that I use with my clients, for example, that help them succeed, but I want to do it in a way where I really explain in depth what I'm talking about. I also like to give context, why I'm giving a certain advice. So that's how I'm planning to do these episodes. So they are probably going to be quite long, just as a warning. And personally, I am not that big of a fan of interview type podcasts. So where there is the host and he invites different guests to interview. I am not saying that I'm not going to do it at all, because I do not have the expertise on all the topics that I want to talk about, but mainly it's going to just be me talking. So that's kind of what you can expect. And finally, I really don't want to create some kind of like a super professional. I like to listen to podcasts created by just normal people who I can relate to. So, to set the scene, I am sitting on the floor in our living room because we have this super fluffy carpet that is super comfortable to sit on. And I am sitting on the floor because I am 7 months pregnant, and this is at the moment the most comfortable for me. I've been sitting in a chair the whole day, and my back really hurts. And on the floor, I can change the position a bit. And you may probably hear that I will be running out of breath. And I will definitely need to take breaks. I will edit those. You will not have to hear them. But you could think, why am I starting this podcast now? Well, I think now is as good a time as any. And this is something I teach my clients in my one on one coaching practice, to start doing courageous new things, even when they feel like it's not the perfect time and they don't have the perfect circumstances and they are nervous. I still encourage them that they need to try, because chances are you will never feel ready and you will never have the perfect circumstances. But it would be quite hypocritical of me to want that from my clients, but not kind of doing it myself. So that's why I'm recording this podcast now, because now I felt like doing it. So I just started. Okay, I just needed to take one of those breathing breaks. I'm really curious how this is gonna go, because I'm planning to publish an episode a week, and I think you will really be able to see how my getting out of breath is getting worse and worse with every week. So exciting stuff coming up. But let's finally dive into today's topic. I titled this episode Why Job Seeking is So Hard Nowadays. And I think that's a super important question to answer before we dive into some kind of specific advice on job seeking. Because I want to really pause and acknowledge that it's a fact. Job seeking nowadays is really hard, and it's way harder than it was 10, 20, 50 years ago. If it wasn't the case, my business would not exist. I would not be doing what I'm doing, because there would not be a need for some external person to help people with their job seeking. If it was very straightforward, if all it took was putting together a CV with a bit of common sense and showing up to an interview and explaining what you do, and that would be it, I would be out of business. Nobody would listen to me, nobody would read my LinkedIn posts, but that is not the case. So that means that there is a lot of complexity to today's job seeking. It is simply a fact. It's not that we are spoiled millennials who are making everything a bigger deal than it actually is. So if you've been a job seeker for a while and you've been wondering that, is it just me or is this really like hard and complicated, then let me assure you that it's not you. The world has changed. Everything about the way we work has changed. So it would be silly to assume that such a big part of work, which is recruitment, which is finding new jobs and finding new employees, would stay the same. Job seeking is harder nowadays. But because if I understand what I'm up against, where do I exist, what are the influences, it helps me to set my expectations accordingly, and it helps me to prepare the strategies accordingly. So, for example, I have my own business, and it's really important for me to, not just like do my own thing, but also understand that what is the context, what is the economy, how are the chances of new businesses, because then it helps me, as I mentioned, to set my expectations and also to prepare strategies that would succeed in this specific environment. And I feel like with job seeking, often we reduce the conversation to just talking about what the economy is like and if companies are hiring or not, but there are more complexities to that. The fact that at the moment, for example, here in Finland, the economy is not really thriving, the job market is definitely not thriving, there are not many open positions. That is just one aspect that makes it hard on top of the other aspects that I'm gonna talk about. But without further ado, I will just introduce the first aspect. And I believe the first reason why job seeking is so hard is that we are never actually properly taught how to search for a job and how to succeed in a recruitment process. When I was in high school, we maybe once learned how to make a CV, but I would be very skeptical that that specific teacher had any kind of updated knowledge of what a successful CV looks like nowadays or what it looked like back then. Then, when I was at the university, we had this career center there. All it did was that it kept like kind of a job board. So it posted some open internships for people that they could apply for. And then they would organize these CV clinics where they would, back then I took them as a like a very serious authority on the art of CVs. Now looking back, knowing what I know and having the experience that I have, a lot of the advice was not very helpful. And the people who worked in the career center, they worked for decades in that job, and they were not really in that close touch with businesses. I do not know what they based their knowledge on, how they upkept their knowledge so that it's updated, but I am a bit worried that there wasn't much updating of knowledge happening, that they were basing the advice they were giving to students on something they learned many, many years ago. So even though one of the reasons why we go to university and why we go to school, to any kind of education, is to be prepared for the future, and it is kind of an obvious step for the future for all of us that we will be looking for jobs, and yet the amount of time and effort that is dedicated to actually teaching us how to search for jobs is minimal to non-existent. And as I'm going to be talking a lot throughout this podcast, nowadays to succeed, it takes much more than just putting together a CV. You also need to consider networking. You also need to consider personal branding. You need to consider upkeeping your employability, your skills. And that is something that nobody ever mentioned to me, or it was mentioned in the sense of networking is important, which, okay, that sounds like a good like a good thing, but nobody explained to me what it actually means. What does it look like how do I actually network, and how does it relate to a job search? Like, okay, networking is meeting people, but how does that connect with searching for jobs? So I think that one reason why, for example, my posts on LinkedIn get so much attention is that I am teaching people how to actually search for a job. I do not assume that it's some basic knowledge that everyone has, and I don't assume that finding a job nowadays is a common sense. I know what it takes from my own experience, from the experience of lots of different people that I have worked with. And I think it is really time that we properly learn how to search for a job. It is not your fault that you were never properly taught this, but now it's time for you to start looking for the tools and ways to really upgrade your skills in job seeking. And the second reason why job seeking is so hard is a bit related to this. And that is the fact that a lot of the advice out there is very outdated or insufficient. So, as I mentioned, my university career center, and actually I studied in 4 different countries in 4 different universities. So, throughout my student career, I visited 4 different career centers in 4 countries, and they all made the same mistakes, which was just very strong focus on a CV, which for a student who has no work experience, tinkering and improving their CV is not where they should be spending their time. Because I had very little to put on my CV, so I could come up with 100 different ways to say the nothing that I had in my background back then, but I could have spent that time on much more valuable things, such as, for example, networking, personal branding, or learning skills outside the formal education, the university that employers actually wanted to see. But nobody told me that. Nobody told me that, hey, CV is one thing, but you need to do much more. You need to focus on other things. You need to really think what kind of jobs you want to get. You need to look at what are the requirements. You need to think about how do you fulfill those requirements. Everyone just look at my CV, which had some basic summer jobs and my studies, and kind of told me how to rewrite it a million times over. So this very strong focus on CVs is one very outdated advice, I think, because yes, in the past, that's all it took. You really just needed a CV, you showed it, and you got an interview invite. But nowadays, you are up against such a massive competition that no matter how beautifully your experience is worded, there are people who have more to offer than you. And not to mention that a lot of the advice that is about the CV is insufficient. How many of us have heard, check your spelling, don't make it generic? And I think everyone knows it by now, but there are more kind of advanced strategies that you can use with your CV. I'm, for example, teaching them in my career incubator course, and I'm also gonna make some episodes on this topic because there is a lot to be said about the CV. But my point is that it should not be the one and only focus, that we should talk about other topics that relate to job seeking. The way I teach it to my clients and in my course is that to succeed in job seeking, there are four main activities. It is firstly job applying. So, yes, for that you need a CV, but there are different aspects that are in play. It also depends what kind of jobs you apply to. If there is some kind of logic, if you focus on one field and really position yourself as an expert in that field, or if you are applying to jobs in 100 different fields, then yes, there is that CV. There is also a LinkedIn profile, which is nowadays more important in many industries than your CV. Then there is some potential cover letter, but that's just like one leg, that's just 25% job applying. The second aspect is networking, so meeting people, deepening connections with them, expanding the number of people you know, and expanding your knowledge of different jobs and trends through talking with people. The third aspect is personal branding, which doesn't need to be anything fancy. It just means that you communicate who you are and what you can do in some kind of aligned way with the jobs that you want to get. And finally, it's increasing employability, which means constantly keeping an eye on your skill set, on your desirability on the job market, keeping an eye on what the jobs that you want to do require, and making sure that your skill set is in demand, meaning that what you have to offer is something that companies actually want from their applicants. So, as a summary, four aspects: job applying, networking, personal branding, increasing employability. All of them are equally important. Neglecting any of them lowers your chances of finding a job, lowers your chances of standing out of the crowd, minimizes your chances of actually being contacted by recruiters. The way I teach my clients and my courses is that you eventually get to a point where job applying is not something you do. You only focus on networking, personal branding, and increasing employability, and the opportunities come to you because of how desirable and well connected in the job market you are. And that is not some like utopian dream that is only reserved for few selected people. That is actually how it can work if you focus your energy and your time accordingly into all these different activities. But majority of the advice out there is only on the job applying portion, neglecting the other three and presenting it as that is something like extra, that is something you should only do if you have the time and energy. And I think it's so great that nowadays we live in the times where we are not so much in the dark. There are so many, for example, recruiters who share their knowledge on LinkedIn, who share exactly what they are looking for in employees, making it so much easier that we can update our knowledge and we can get access to all that is needed to succeed in job seeking. But it is about being proactive and proactively seeking this kind of advice and looking at people who actually know what they're talking about and listening to their relevant advice. So not relying on the bare minimum be it University Career Center, be it the unemployment office. I don't want to diminish that people who do these jobs are extremely hardworking and many of them are very committed, but often these places do not have the resources to really equip their employees with the most updated knowledge on how the job market works. And actually, another thing I want to do frequently in this podcast is reflecting on my own journey and on my own, let's call them missteps. And I believe one of the main ones, if I could name one thing that really cost me so much time, so much rejected applications, was that I approached job seeking as if it was like a common sense thing. I thought, hey, I'm smart. I know how to put together a CV that sounds good. I'm smart. I know how to apply for jobs. I'm smart, so I would be a good catch for some company. And as I'm trying to explain throughout this episode, it is not that simple. It is not a matter of common sense anymore. And when I started my business last year, nobody would expect that that's a matter of common sense to start the kind of business that I started. It was obvious that I will need to ask people for advice, to ask people for support, to find mentors, to find coaches, to read a lot about the topic. And I think that job seeking is very similar actually to starting a business. I can see so many parallels, but one big difference I see is in the approach and in the level to which entrepreneurs seek a lot of advice and expect that it will take a lot of effort, while many job seekers, just like I was, still rely on their own knowledge and on their own common sense. And it's not about the fact that you are not smart and not capable, but the times have become so complex that you need a little bit more than your common sense. So it's really important to acknowledge it and to start seeking relevant advice. Since you are listening to this podcast, I think you are clearly someone who recognized that the current job market is kind of beyond what they can master with their common sense. So, congrats on that. Let's look at another reason why the job seeking is so hard. And that is mainly related to jobs in business and tech. That's kind of also my expertise. I have a background in business. I worked as a tech recruiter, and most of my experience is with job seeking for this kind of roles. And I think, especially in this field, it is extremely common that people have some kind of formal education, some kind of university degree, and the problem is that the gap between what we're taught at the university and what the jobs expect is like massive. So I have 2 degrees in business, and now knowing working environment and knowing what I was taught at the university, I can see that I was basically completely unemployable, even though in both of my degrees I was like top of my class. I was the best student. I didn't just sail through it and barely pass my courses that in the end wouldn't really matter. Now, there are some more like abstract ways that the university prepared me well for my jobs and for where I'm now, like the general understanding of different business terms, that I could understand what marketing means and what HR means, because this is not something we are taught in like a lower education, like in high school or primary school. So I could understand these topics. I could have some kind of conversation around these topics. And then it was obviously lots of different skills, like putting together a presentation, working in a team, reading something complex and digesting it, and writing some kind of a text on these topics. But when it came to like practical skills that would be directly applicable in a workplace, I had none. And it was really fascinating to me to read these job ads of jobs that, based on my education, I was supposed to be fully qualified for. I never like overshot that I would be applying for some managerial positions. I was, as a fresh graduate, applying for internships, entry level jobs, junior roles, assistant roles, and so on. And still, for most of these jobs, I simply did not have the skills. For example, in my bachelor's degree, my studies were focused mainly on accounting and financial management. And how we studied that was mainly with pen and paper, so reading textbooks and like writing calculations, or in the more advanced classes, we would use Microsoft Excel and like making some calculations there, making some like budgets or making some kind of accounting there. And that's all I knew. Like I knew the logic of how accounting works and how like finances work, but to the employers, that is not enough. They want that you are able to work with some actual tools, with some accounting software, with some ERP software. Okay, Excel, that is useful, but on a more advanced level where you can actually use complex functions, where you can use macros, and not where you can just like make a table and you use it as a bit of a fancier calculator, which is exactly what my skills were. And even if it was a junior level job, the employer still needed that you to some extent can be up to speed quite quickly, that nobody will spend 6 months teaching you how to use their accounting software, understandably. And the problem is that if when I never touched any accounting software, it's really hard for me to grasp the whole logic of how the data flows from one end to the next. I also saw then when I was a recruiter, and I was a tech recruiter, so that is extremely about working with different tools, technologies, programming languages, and so on. And it simply was not enough that someone had a degree and knew the logic of how certain technology works. The employers wanted to see that someone actually touched it with their hands. Otherwise, it was unfortunately not sufficient for them. If there is one thing that is highly valued in today's workplaces, it is speed. You need to be quickly ready to jump into the projects. You need to be quickly ready to really contribute, to actually work. There is no time to onboard you for 6 months, because in 6 months everything will change. The world will probably be in a completely different place. The company will be in a completely different place. And teaching this one person this tool for 6 months because they will then stay with us for the rest of their life and use this tool for the rest of their lives is kind of false. It's not gonna work that way. In this podcast, I don't wanna look for who is to blame, and let's blame the universities and let's blame the employers that they have unreasonable requests and let's blame this and that. I just want to describe what is the situation, give you the overview of how it works, and help you make the right decisions for you and for your career. That is the best I can aim for, and it is really not worth your or my time to try to dig deep into why universities don't prepare people better for the job market these days, if that's even their job. That is a topic for someone else, not for me. And although I'm giving like my specific example with accounting, it is true for most business jobs. Like if you studied marketing, and then probably most of your studies were spent making some kind of like campaigns and making presentations and making some like advertising, but you probably were not taught like hands-on what is digital marketing, how do the different disciplines within digital marketing works. And that is something that you can definitely expect you will encounter in your job, especially as someone entry level. And this mismatch between formal education and what employers want is one aspect, but there is another aspect, and that is the fact that a lot of the things that, let's say, 20, 30 years ago would really set you apart are nowadays seen as either standard, everyone else has it as well, or something that is hard to translate into what kind of benefit would that bring. So, for example, I used to think that the fact that I speak several foreign languages is really helpful for me, that it will set me apart in the job search, that I will seem more like smart and international. But unless I would be applying for jobs where those foreign languages are actually used, which is, for example, jobs like sales, like customer service, that I was not very interested in getting, it didn't give me any specific edge. Let's say for my parents' generation, it was a huge advantage that they speak English as a second language. Nowadays, speaking English as a second language is a basic requirement. It really does not give you any sort of edge over other applicants. similarly as, for example, having some experience from abroad. It is so common nowadays that people go on a student exchange or they do some kind of internship abroad. It's something that has become so norm that it's not even worth mentioning in your CV because it really won't give you any kind of edge. Also, education. There are so many people nowadays with a university degree that it's either taken as a standard or, as I was talking about, it actually doesn't give you any benefit for the job. What employers actually want to see is that you know how to use the tools that they use. You know the field well in which you want to work, and then different skills like that you have a good time management skills, that you can organize your work really well, that you can manage projects, that you can manage stress, that you can communicate well with different people, you can discuss problems and solutions effectively. Those are things that actually matter. You can never just rely on, for example, your university studies. You should always be improving your skills elsewhere. But even if you are working, you should not rely on the incremental learning that the job offers you. You should always be looking outside, thinking about what next, thinking about how to stay relevant in the job market. And the final reason that I want to talk about today, why job seeking is so hard, is that many of us don't actually know what kind of job we want. Again, looking back at my experience, when I was a job seeker, on one hand, the way I thought about it was I just want a job, any job. I don't even care. Like, all I need is a job, all I need is a paycheck. But that wasn't true. Like, if that was true, then I would obviously find some job. But I I felt entitled to find a job that was aligned with my background, that would kind of consider the fact that I had a university degree. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It cost the state a lot of money to put me through university. And if at the end I would take a job that did not require a university degree, that wouldn't make financial sense for the economy, because the point was that I get a higher paying job from which I would pay higher taxes and contribute highly to the social system, for example. So I think it's a good thing to be entitled. Like, if you work really hard to get a degree, you should get a job where you actually put that degree to a good use. And then, like, even if I narrowed it to jobs that were like within my field, or that would be something that someone with a university degree could do, I still had some like wishes and hopes and dreams and interests. It's really hard to suppress that. It's really hard to put the amount of effort that today's job seeking requires into getting a job that you in the end don't even want to do. I was applying for many jobs, and obviously in those many jobs there were applications that, like, the company didn't really seem that interesting to me. The job didn't seem that interesting, but I was just very desperate. Like, I very much needed a job. And I thought that, okay, I will apply for this job. Maybe I get it. And then I will have this pressure off that I need to start earning money and I can start looking for something more interesting. But then it just shows in your application. If you're applying for a job that you don't really want, the recruiters can see it. I could always see it when I was in an interview with someone who was just in like a tricky situation that they really needed a different job, but they weren't actually at all interested in this specific position. And enthusiasm and motivation towards a certain position is nowadays a super important criterion, and something that can get you rejected from a job, even if you are perfectly qualified on paper. Unless the employer can see that you're actually motivated, you will do your best in that specific job and you're committed to staying with that company for some amount of time, they will rather employ someone who has a bit less experience, but they really show that enthusiasm towards that job and towards that company. So that's why applying for many random jobs that you don't even want to get is not the best strategy, because it's not a successful strategy. And even if you are in a situation where it's not so much about wanting to, for example, change a job and wanting to get some new kind of challenges, but it's more like out of despair that you really need a job for whatever reason, you still need to approach it from the point of what do you actually want to do and then packaging your experience and your personal brand around that specific field that you're interested in. So knowing what you want and then targeting all the different job seeking activities that I was mentioning on that specific field is like absolutely crucial to succeed nowadays. And therefore, if you do not know what you actually want, what kind of job you're interested in, or you know it, but you tell yourself that those jobs are hard to get, or that you don't have a chance, or that you tried and you got a few rejections, it's kind of the same. And one super important thing in job seeking nowadays is consistency. Your LinkedIn profile and your CV need to communicate some kind of a clear, coherent story that you then talk about when job applying, and it is clear why you are applying for the jobs you're applying. You are centering the other activities, networking, personal branding, increasing employability, all on one field. You are not just randomly showing up to any networking event out there, and you are not posting on LinkedIn about 200 different topics. You are focusing everything on one topic so that you establish yourself as an expert in that particular field, because that's what employers want to see. They want to see experts who can confidently communicate this expertise. So if this is something that you can recognize that you are not maybe that clear on the field in which you are applying for jobs, and you think that you're being smart by spreading your efforts to as a wide range of jobs as possible, just know that that is not a good strategy. And that is something I spend the most amount of time on with my clients, to defining the field in which they want to work, and then centering all their communication and all their activities on that specific field. Because in my experience, that is the only way to succeed in your career in the long term. I don't work with people in a way that, okay, just quickly get a job so that I have you off my chest. I help people build careers so that they get a job from which there is some logical path to the next job, and that they don't need to always be in this endless cycle of getting a job to get a paycheck, then losing that job for whatever reason, or deciding you want something new, again applying, starting from scratch, having to reinvent yourself. That is not a fun way to spend your career. I find it way better to really sit down and define the field in which you want to work, define the kind of expert you are and you want to be, and one step at a time building towards actually establishing a career. Because if you are just focusing on finding a job, you will possibly succeed after some time. You will find a job, but you will set yourself up for a situation where you will need to then eventually look for another job. You are not creating any kind of base from which you will be able to benefit. And as you progress in your career, and as your requirements, for example, for a salary, for the responsibilities will increase, the employer's expectation will increase. So if you are always starting from scratch, it will be very difficult to get to the higher positions. And as someone who is listening to podcasts about careers, then I believe that you are an ambitious person who has goals and dreams and who really wants to find a fulfilling career, which is totally possible for you, whoever you are and wherever you are right now. But it's time to start focusing all your efforts on one specific field. But to sum it up, and as a reminder, yes, job seeking is hard. It is much more difficult than it was. So it is unpleasant, but to a certain extent normal to struggle. But right now, if you are a job seeker, I really want you to take this time not as just kind of finding your job, but to think about building foundations of your career so that potentially you never find yourself in this situation ever again. Because another defining factor of today's job market and world in general is high unpredictability. So even if you do find a job, there is no such thing as a steady job anymore. You can lose that job, and probably the last thing you will want to do is starting from scratch. So approaching job seeking more strategically, which I'm helping you do by sharing these insights, by explaining how recruitments, the job market work these days. You can use all these insights in order to take a more strategic approach to your job seeking. And if you really want to approach your job seeking strategically and take yourself to the next level, and also if you are tired from trying to figure things out on your own and you want someone else to just take you through the journey, give you all the details and what you need to do and succeed, then I want to invite you to check out my Career Incubator course, because I've created it having all these insights that I'm sharing with you in mind. I'm helping you through the whole process of finding your dream job, from defining your ideal field in which you want to work, to positioning yourself as an expert, to perfecting your application materials, your CV and LinkedIn profile using insights that I gained while working as a recruiter, to then talking about the four main activities that I mentioned in this podcast and telling you exactly how to implement it considering your specific circumstances. It's really so packed with valuable insights. It is something that if I had that when I was a job seeker, that would save me so much time, money, but most importantly, sanity. I will have a link in the description box in the show notes so that you can take a look at it. If you have any questions about it, you can reach me on my LinkedIn at Carolina Numinen. You will also find the link under this episode. This course could be something that finally sets you off to a fresh start and to a successful path towards finding your dream job without losing your mind, which is my main promise from the course. For today, I'm gonna wrap this up here. I'll be really glad if you find me on LinkedIn and follow me, and if you let me know how you enjoyed this episode and if you stick around for more episodes of this podcast. So that's all I've got for you today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will speak to you in the next episode.